This is an inquiry into the International Monetary Fund. The International Monetary Fund, or the IMF, was set up in 1944 to establish a framework for economic cooperation to ensure the stability and prosperity of the global economy. But for billions of people, the experience of engaging with the IMF over the decades has been very different. Look at Ukraine. The IMF continues to extract $2.3 billion in annual fees and payments while the government struggles to provide for over 6.5 million displaced people amidst a war. If you look at Afghanistan, 97% of the population is set to plunge into poverty, but the IMF has cut off the country's access to funds. Travel to this part of the world, to Argentina, the IMF ignored warnings from its own staff to push a record loan of $56.3 billion that led to a violation of Argentinian sovereignty and to a violation of its own bylaws. I want to be very clear then about why we're convening this inquiry. This isn't about accidents or policy failures or ineffectiveness, because any review of the IMF's lending practices reveals a pattern of illegality, of impunity, and a disregard for human rights that stretches across continents. The IMF is a public institution that lends public money with a mandate to serve public purpose, but it answers to no one. There is no authority currently in the world that can hold the IMF accountable for its actions. In just a few days from now, on 18th April, the leadership of the IMF will gather in Washington, D.C. to discuss and to reaffirm its mandate to guarantee financial stability, achieve sustainable growth, and reduce global poverty. So the members of today's inquiry have questions for the IMF. Over the next hour, we'll hear from economists, lawyers, parliamentarians, and human rights experts from Argentina, the US, Greece, Ukraine, Kenya, Pakistan, and India, bringing stories, but also evidence of the IMF systematically violating its mandate. We don't have a court to go to. There's no committee at the IMF to file a complaint with. There's no investigative agency that could be tasked with this job. That's why this inquiry is so crucial. I'm Varsha Gandikota-Nalutla from the Secretariat of the Progressive International, and I'm honored to be chairing the first ever Progressive International inquiry into the IMF, alongside partners like the Jubilee Debt Campaign, African Forum and Network on Debt and Development, Center for Economic Policy and Research, Global Justice Now, and the Gravel Institute. For all of you watching from around the world, subtitles are available in Spanish and English that you can choose from below. The inquiry today will do two things. It will ask certain key questions that are crucial to any international institution and present evidence from across the world, from different countries. So I want to start with the very first question, with the basics. What is the scope of the IMF? What can it do and not do? Is there anything that it cannot do? I think we always assume that the plethora of international laws, treaties, and covenants that we've come up with over the decades sort of just run in the background, overlooking the entire architecture of international institutions. But is this really true in IMF's case? Let's go back and ask, are there any rules or laws that dictate the boundaries of the IMF's mandate? To answer this, I want to invite the first member of the inquiry to the floor, Andrés Arauz. Andrés is a former Minister of Knowledge of Ecuador and a former central bank governor, central bank general director. Andrés is a founding member of the Dollarization Observatory and a former board member of the nascent Bank of the South. He's currently at the Autonomous University of Mexico, or UNAM. Andrés, the floor is yours.
Today I'm going to talk to you about a UN institution. Yes, an institution of the United Nations, a specialized agency of the United Nations, but that doesn't act like one, that acts in total impunity without respecting public international law. I'm talking about the International Monetary Fund. The International Monetary Fund does not respect UN resolutions, the UN Charter, when it has to recognize or decide who is the governing party in a country. For example, it has frozen Afghanistan's assets, even though there is a government acting, controlling the central bank. It has frozen Venezuela's assets, saying that there is uncertainty as who the president of Venezuela is. Come on, everybody knows that Guaido is a joke. What is it that allows the IMF to exert these unilateral coercive measures against sovereign countries, basically on their own? It is the fact that the IMF is acting with total impunity, not respecting public international law, not respecting customary law and UN Charter indications. It doesn't even respect the United Nations International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. When the IMF exerts policy influence, what are called the conditions that they demand the countries comply with when they give out loans, they are not complying with the human rights obligations that are universal in nature. They are an international treaty. They are part of international public law. However, they are completely ignored by the IMF. The International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights demands that the maximum available resources be available for guaranteeing social and economic rights, rights to food, to housing, to having education and health. However, the IMF completely ignores that. Therefore, the IMF is completely out of scope in terms of complying with the International Sustainable Development Goals, another UN decision at the General Assembly. This was agreed by consensus by every country in the world, that we should eradicate poverty, that we should have gender equality, and so on. But what happens? They are not even part of the framework that the IMF analyzes when it gives out the loans. It is completely out of sync with the priorities of the international community, even though it's a UN specialized agency. What else is happening? The IMF, when it lends money to countries, usually requires what is called the deregulation of the capital account. This is not technical. It basically means that countries that take IMF loans have to do away with all the controls and enforcement that countries via their central banks or other authorities have on the entry and outflow of money, usually to protect domestic industries or to protect vulnerable population from financial instability, but also to avoid tax evasion and to control for money laundering. When the IMF deregulates the capital account, it is basically lending into capital flight and tax evasion, going also against international standards, treaties on this matter. Another good example is the issue of climate. IMF does not respect the climate agreements that have been signed by so many countries in the world. Again, public international law. The IMF doesn't take into account carbon statistics or the emissions targeting that has to be done and the commitments and obligations from different countries in the world. They are now going to create what's called the Resiliency and Sustainability Trusts, supposedly for pandemic preparedness and to fight climate change. But they're not even taking into account the Secretariat of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. They're not even taking into account the recommendations on the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. They are not working together with the UN specialized institutions on environmental accounting and ecosystem accounting that would be fundamental if such a fund would actually work. We see that the IMF is only focusing on one issue regarding climate change, which is basically hiking the price of gasoline in vulnerable countries so as to create more social unrest and to put populations in a vulnerable situation. And trust me, they're not doing this because of their commitment to climate. They're doing it because of their neoliberal obsession and dogma with the deregulation of prices and doing away with price controls. The IMF applies all of this with a huge veil of secrecy. They exert what are called prior actions before lending. Nobody knows what these are except the government that is implied. The population is unaware that the IMF, behind their backs, is demanding that the government take certain measures. We think that it just comes as a painful economic measure that a government takes, but they are actually part of the conditionality that the IMF requires from governments even before giving out a loan. This is very worrisome because this huge veil of secrecy doesn't allow for civil society to react. We can't react timely. We can't react on time because we are not even aware where the punch is coming from. All of this means impunity. Impunity for the IMF to act and destroy national economies, to not comply with international commitments, or to even attack sovereign governments around the world. The IMF, when it negotiates an agreement with a country, doesn't call it an agreement, because an agreement would imply that it would have to fulfill the requirements of an international treaty. That is why we must require the IMF to abide and to sign the 1989 Vienna Convention on Treaties between sovereign governments and international organizations, so that the agreements that are signed with every loan between the IMF and every country have to have some scrutiny so that they pass the legislative requirements and so that they can be analyzed in an international court of law. Otherwise, they are what the IMF calls unilateral actions. That's why they call them letters of intent. They're saying, no, they are just letters that the ministry unilaterally signed, and this is the IMF unilaterally giving out a loan, when everybody knows, and it's far obvious, that it's an agreement. Therefore, it should abide by international agreements. Now, there is one thing the IMF has done correctly with the last few years, but even then with some mistakes. And I'm talking about the special drawing rights. But this is not an IMF handout, like they like to say. This is a political decision taken by the 190 members of the IMF at the Board of Governors, and they decided politically again to create money out of thin air and to distribute it politically to the 190 members of the international community, those that are members of the IMF. Now, this is very important because it shows us that SDRs can be created out of nowhere, that they can become a political decision, that money can be subordinated to the politics, the international arena, and then we can use them for good things, like for fighting against climate change, like for confronting these food crises that we're about to live in, by eradicating hunger and poverty. There is no lack of monetary resources. There is no lack of money to do all these things. That is why SDRs are so important. And us, the progressive movements of the world, have to reclaim SDRs as a progressive instrument for the eradication of poverty, of hunger, and for the possibility to reach the humanity's goals in terms of fighting climate change. That is what the IMF is about. We have to overcome the age of IMF impunity and arrive to the era where the IMF is an instrument of international cooperation and where progressive people have to understand what it is about. Otherwise, we're gonna continue getting hit and we're not even gonna know where the punch is coming from.
Thank you for your contribution, Andres. It's shocking to hear the details of the IMF separation from the UN system. We've always known, of course, that the International Monetary Fund, although it sits within the United Nations system, retains its independence. But in this case, independence really seems to mean impunity. And this makes me ask the question, why should the IMF exist? And in fact, we asked our viewers to submit questions to this inquiry, and many of them asked the same question. So I want to turn to the next member of the inquiry, Yanis Varoufakis, who could perhaps walk us through the history of the IMF. How did it begin? And where did we go so wrong? For those of you watching, Yanis is a member of the Hellenic Parliament and the Secretary General of Mera25. He's a co-founder of DM25 and the former Finance Minister of Greece. Over to you, Yanis.
Hello, this is Yanis Varoufakis with a message for our comrades in the Progressive International regarding the International Monetary Fund. The International Monetary Fund, when it was conceived back in the Bretton Woods Conference in 1944, was a splendid idea. The idea was effectively to put the financial genie into the bottle, to have capital controls, very boring banking, prevent bankers from doing that which they've been doing in recent decades, an extension of the New Deal constraints to be placed upon bankers, to have fixed exchange rates, more or less constant interest rates across the countries participating, and have the IMF operating as a pillar of stability, of financial stability, providing loans that were necessary to keep the fixed exchange rates fixed, while the World Bank would provide developmental funds. That was the plan in 1944. When Bretton Woods, the system, which was based on constraining what bankers could do internationally, constraining finance and unleashing the conglomerates, of course, because there is a dark side to the Bretton Woods system, to the New Deal writ large after the Second World War. Don't forget that during that period we had imperialism, we had Vietnam, we had the overthrow of the democratically elected government of Mossadegh in Iran, the fascist dictatorship here in our country. It wasn't a brilliant period, but it was a period during which financial capital was constrained severely and there was stability, serious reduction in inequality, the best period, the golden age of capitalism, which of course ended when America became a deficit country in the late 1960s, and of course in 1971 the Bretton Woods system was blown up. Since then, the International Monetary Fund changed spots. It became a malignant growth. It became the bailiff of international financial sharks, of the financial genie that escaped from the Bretton Woods bottle. It all began in the 1970s with the structural adjustment programs for African and Asian poor countries, the combination of lending to the local bourgeoisie in order to allow them to bring their money out, while at the same time privatizing everything, absolutely everything, from natural resources to schools and hospitals. The IMF became the eye of all evil. In the late 1990s, the IMF did the same evil deed that it had started in Africa and Asia, in South Korea, in the countries of Southeast Asia, to the extent that even to this day, I don't think that any Korean wants to even hear the acronym IMF. After the IMF was almost chased out of South Korea and the rest of the Southeast Asian countries for their misdeeds during the 1998 financial crash of that part of the world, the IMF effectively became persona non grata or institution non grata across the world. They seized their fantastic opportunity to come back into things, into the fray, when the great financial collapse of 2008, its shockwave reached Europe. All the European banks went bankrupt, the Greek state became bankrupt, and through the troika of Greece's lenders, the IMF returned to the fray along with the European Commission and the European Central Bank. For years, the IMF, while it was kicking and screaming about the inanity of the Eurozone's, the European Union's policies in places like Greece, at the very same time, they used that inanity, they hid behind Berlin, behind Frankfurt, in order to do their worst on behalf of the worst creditors the world has ever seen. This huge disconnect between, on the one hand, some good people working at the IMF, researchers, staff, producing decent papers, even advocating that trade unions should be encouraged, that labor market deregulation had gone too far. So that was one side of the IMF, but it was a completely irrelevant part. What mattered was the European leadership of the IMF, along with the American leadership, that was ensuring that the IMF continued to work as bailiffs on behalf of the very, very few, the oligarchs in the United States and Europe. The clash between the IMF and Greece, especially at the time when I was finance minister, did much to utterly and totally wreck the image of the IMF. And following the replacement of Christine Lagarde, there was an attempt by the IMF to go back to its roots, to redeem itself. But it is not redeemable. And it is not redeemable because, in a sense, we can locate the reasons why, after the end of Bretton Woods, the IMF turned toxic in the rejection of the original idea by John Maynard Keynes back in 1944 of what the IMF should be all about. Keynes' idea was that the IMF should provide, in the form of the central bank of the world, a digital currency. It wasn't digital in his mind, it is digital today, but an accounting unit that would be used to denominate the world's trade and capital flows. This is a technical matter, but what it would mean, in a sense, is that the global community, the community of nations, would ensure that trade and capital flows are balanced. That would be in the interest of humanity, it would be in the interest of parliaments, it would be in the interest of the majority of people, but it would not be in the interest of bankers, it would not be in the interest of American administrations seeking to maintain their exorbitant power over the rest of the Western world, the capitalist world. At this present juncture, the IMF is simultaneously weak in the sense that it has absolutely zero credibility around the world, and almighty in the sense that, to this day, it maintains the power to wreck countries like Argentina, Greece, Pakistan, and so on. It symbolizes the manner in which globalized capitalism is sinking under the weight of its own hubris. The Progressive International has a duty, I believe, at long last, to come up with a global plan. We have to answer the question, if we don't like the IMF, the World Bank, if we don't like the predominance of the financial sector, what I call techno-feudalism, you can call it whatever you want, what do we want to put in its place? It's not enough, comrades, anymore to resist, to say no, to lambast the IMF. It is time for us to have a global plan, a progressive one, that would replace, if we ever got anywhere near power in our countries, respectively, in our continents around the world, how we would replace the system that has turned the IMF into the bailiff of the oligarchies around the world. Carpe diem.
Thank you, Yanis. You're right. That is the project. What are the institutions we want to put in place to protect both the sovereignty of governments of countries around the world and the popular will of the people inside them? To do that, though, we have to very carefully pay close attention to places where violations occurred, and the majority of them are in the global south. One of them is, of course, Argentina. For the next member of the inquiry, I want to call Fernanda Vallejos from Argentina, who is an economist and a politician who served as a national deputy elected from the Buenos Aires province. She worked as an advisor at the Ministry of Economy and at the National Congress. She's a finance coordinator for Soberanas, a new political organization. Fernanda, we know that Argentina was on the brink of default less than a couple of months ago. What happened there? The floor is yours.
En primer lugar, quiero agradecer muy especialmente por la organización de este evento. Estoy muy feliz de poder estar aquí con ustedes. Para nosotros, como argentinos y argentinas, es realmente muy, pero muy valioso. No sé si saben que cuando fue creado en 1946 el Fondo Monetario, nuestro presidente Juan Perón rechazó la posibilidad de que la Argentina forme parte del organismo. Sin embargo, la dictadura que lo derrocó adhirió al país 10 años después, en 1956. Desde ese momento hasta 2004, Argentina suscribió 21 acuerdos con el Fondo Monetario Internacional con fuertes condicionalidades de política. Cuando a finales de 2005 el presidente Néstor Kirchner pagó la deuda y echó del país al organismo, recuperamos nuestra autonomía durante 12 maravillosos años. No imaginábamos en aquel momento que en junio de 2018 Mauricio Macri reanudaría ese vínculo de dependencia. Macri recibió un país desendeudado, la deuda con organismos multilaterales representaba apenas el 6% de nuestro PBI, mientras que con acreedores privados la deuda externa era del 8%, pero el gobierno macrista fue muy diligente en sus resoluciones. A la semana de asumir, el Banco Central eliminó las regulaciones sobre la compra-venta de moneda extranjera, A partir de ese momento se pudo adquirir una cantidad ilimitada de dólares sin demostrar el origen de los fondos ante la administración fiscal. Además de la desregulación en el frente cambiario, el gobierno se volcó de manera casi inmediata a la emisión de deuda pública en moneda extranjera. Junto con el festival de emisión de bonos, el deterioro del frente externo fue notable. En 2 años agotaron el crédito voluntario al que tenía acceso el país, aumentando la deuda en moneda extranjera en más de 53.000 millones de dólares. La fuga de capitales de los residentes para mediados de 2018 había acumulado en 30 meses un saldo de 48.775 millones de dólares y fueron a buscar al Fondo Monetario para no interrumpir ese obsceno proceso. El directorio del organismo aprobó el 20 de junio de 2018 un préstamo excepcional para la Argentina por 50.000 millones de dólares. A pesar de que en el informe de julio del 18 sobre el stand-by de Argentina, el staff del FMI abría de alguna manera el paraguas, poniendo en duda la sostenibilidad de la deuda del gobierno nacional, a pesar de que el primer desembolso de 15.000 millones de dólares financió la fuga de 15.037 millones de dólares entre junio y septiembre, y a pesar de que el gobierno no cumplió ninguna de las metas acordadas en junio, el 26 de octubre del 2018 el directorio del FMI aprobó la ampliación del crédito a 56.300 millones, casi el 1.300% de la cuota argentina en el organismo. De ese total se terminaron desembolsando 44.500 millones de dólares. El interés norteamericano en alinear geopolíticamente a América Latina detrás de su estrategia es probablemente la única forma de explicar el otorgamiento a nuestro país del préstamo más grande de la historia de la institución multilateral. Un grillete reforzado por el cronograma que se acordó para su devolución de imposible cumplimiento, en especial en los años 2022 y 2023, con una fuerte concentración de casi 20.000 millones de dólares de vencimientos cada uno de esos años. ¿Y para qué sirvió ese préstamo? Para que la oligarquía doméstica pudiera fugar en menos de 1 año y medio 40.650 millones de dólares, mientras que un puñado de especuladores internacionales pudo llevarse otros 10.150 millones de dólares. La contrapartida, una deuda externa pública con el Fondo Monetario de 44.500 millones más intereses y recargos a cuenta del pueblo argentino, mientras que el Banco Central sufrió una disminución neta de las reservas de 4.695 millones en el mismo periodo. Todo eso a pesar de que el artículo 6 del convenio constitutivo del organismo prohíbe de manera taxativa que los recursos del fondo sean aplicados para hacer frente a una salida considerable o continua de capital. La violación fue flagrante. Mientras se consumaba el saqueo, los salarios pasaron de representar el 54,2% del ingreso nacional en el primer trimestre de 2016 al 46,8% en el cuarto trimestre de 2019. En paralelo, la desocupación abierta escaló desde el 5,9% en la última medición de 2015 al 8,9% en el cuarto trimestre de 2019. El PBI se derrumbó 2,6% en 2018 y otro 2% en 2019, lo que por supuesto agravó el problema de insostenibilidad de la deuda. Mauricio Macri y el Fondo Monetario dejaron a la economía en 2019 con más de 16 millones de personas en la pobreza y casi 4 millones en la indigencia. Y todas estas condiciones empeoraron sensiblemente para el país con la pandemia después del cambio de gobierno. Pese a todo, el Fondo Monetario descartó inmediatamente en las negociaciones una reducción de la deuda o una condonación parcial, así como también la opción de un acuerdo especial que extendiera el plazo por lo menos a 20 años para el repago. El menú quedó recortado a su imposición de refinanciar la estafa que se había consumado durante el gobierno de Macri, con un acuerdo de facilidades extendidas sujeto a las condicionalidades de siempre. política fiscal y monetaria contractiva, ajuste tarifario, devaluación de nuestra moneda, etcétera, etcétera. Ese programa sería, por sobre todas las cosas, incompatible con lo que es el principal desafío de economía política en nuestro país, que es mejorar la distribución. Los salarios perdieron 8,5 puntos de participación en el ingreso nacional entre los terceros trimestres de 2016 y 2021 y 2,6 puntos si lo comparamos con el mismo periodo de 2019. Los desembolsos de la nueva deuda para pagar la estafa de 2018 estarían además supeditados a la aprobación de revisiones trimestrales que mantendrían a nuestra economía en permanente estrés financiero y al borde del default. Y además es esperable un escenario donde cuando haya que empezar a devolver el nuevo préstamo en 2026, no se disponga de las divisas, porque la deuda es sencillamente impagable. Y eso empujaría al país a nuevas negociaciones, mayores ajustes, mayores condicionalidades, condenándonos a un nuevo ciclo largo de endeudamiento y decadencia. El debate político que atraviesa actualmente a la Argentina es un debate muy profundo sobre el lugar que deben ocupar el derecho de los pueblos al desarrollo, al bienestar y a la justicia social. ¿Es aceptable que las imposiciones de un organismo como el Fondo Monetario se erijan por encima de los derechos económicos, sociales y culturales del pueblo consagrados en nuestra Constitución Nacional? Y este debate se conjuga además con el hecho de que el stand-by de 2018 forzó el endeudamiento de la Argentina mucho más allá de su capacidad de pago por el interés geopolítico de Estados Unidos en la región. Se hizo sin consenso social y con el rechazo del principal espacio opositor, y se hizo violando las normas del Fondo Monetario. Pero ahora se pretende utilizar al organismo sin reconocimiento de su corresponsabilidad en la escandalosa fuga de los dólares prestados como vehículo para imponer políticas que son rechazadas por el pueblo argentino. ¿Acaso no desnuda esta trama el intento de influencia externa indebida de Estados Unidos y el capital norteamericano en la Argentina y en la región latinoamericana? Argentina no puede renunciar a luchar por la autodeterminación de nuestro pueblo y la titularidad de nuestro destino como nación. Y como condición necesaria para eso, debemos salir de una buena vez por todas de la trampa de la deuda. Esto implica una firme posición por el cumplimiento de la ley local e internacional en la procura de terminar con la impunidad que hace posible la reiteración de los delitos por falta de castigo a los responsables. No ignoramos que el Fondo Monetario tiene inmunidades, que cualquiera de sus acciones están exceptuadas de ser parte de un litigio con cualquier Estado, lo que supone un privilegio inadmisible. Sin embargo, no tiene una inmunidad supranacional que le permita violar sus propias normas. Los privilegios e inmunidades del FMI no son absolutos. Apegándonos a la Carta de las Naciones Unidas, la Corte Internacional de Justicia es el ámbito adecuado para demandar la justicia que merece nuestro pueblo. El pedido de una opinión consultiva pretende poner en evidencia que el Fondo Monetario violó sus normas al incumplir con los artículos 1, 5 y 6 de su convenio constitutivo y que, por lo tanto, cometió actos que son considerados ilícitos por el derecho internacional. Es necesario poner en evidencia la ilicitud de los actos del Fondo Monetario, la responsabilidad emergente y la obligatoriedad de reparar a la Argentina según lo establecido por la Comisión de Derecho Internacional de las Naciones Unidas. Mi país, como otros países hermanos, ha visto la historia repetirse una y otra vez mientras el Fondo Monetario sigue ejerciendo el colonialismo financiero sobre nuestras naciones. Llevar al FMI a la Corte Internacional no solo permitiría a mi país reclamar su soberanía, sino que allanaría además el camino para que otras naciones también dejen de ser víctimas. Estamos convencidos de que es una lucha que vale la pena y sabemos que no estamos solos porque confiamos en la solidaridad de los pueblos. Muchísimas gracias.
These are really tragic details. Fernanda, you talked about financial colonialism and the cycle of dependence that determines many of these debt relationships. But what was perhaps most stunning to me is that the IMF would ignore warnings from its own staff and violate its own bylaws to further these relationships. Again, importantly, without any consequences. What's perhaps even more tragic is that Argentina is not alone. Let's hear now from Kenya, another country that has been on the front lines of the IMF's assault. I want to invite to the floor the next member of the inquiry, Anyang' Nyong'o, who is currently governor of Kenya's Kisumu County. He was also the former Minister for Planning and National Development, as well as the Minister for Medical Services. Governor Nyong'o, Kenya has one of the largest levels of public debt anywhere in the world. What is the IMF's approach to Kenya, and do the people in the country agree?
I am happy to be with you here today, discussing debt, particularly in the third world. And Kenya is one such country. So my discussion will be concentrated on Kenya. Kenya has had a long relationship with IMF since independence in 1963. But we are here much more concerned about the current debt crisis, which puts Kenya in the group of the most distressed, debt-laden countries in the middle and lower income developing countries, now being forced into IMF credit and IMF supervised austerity programs like Argentina and Pakistan. Such austerity programs are usually implemented in the sole interest of satisfying debt repayment at the expense of people's livelihoods, with the likely result of social unrest and political instability. Kenya, along with Ghana, Ethiopia, Angola, Zambia, and Mozambique, will soon suffer the same fate, having been recently classified as high debt distressed economies. Zambia, having defaulted on our debt repayment last year, has already seen what this so-called distress leads to. What is likely to happen to Kenya if she is next in the line? The prospects of going the Zambia way are very high. The IMF and World Bank family are equally scared of this and are seeking advice from non-governmental quarters and international think tanks on how to package rescue plans called debt restructuring with a human face, as it were. But what does the situation in Kenya look like with regard to the IMF loans? What are the facts and figures? Kenya's public debt has increased exponentially during the last 10 years. According to the IMF, gross public debt increased from 44.4% of the gross domestic product in 2010 to 69% of the GDP at the end of 2020, reflecting high deficits, partly driven by spending on large infrastructure projects, as already noted above. The COVID-19 exacerbated the situation, reducing the headroom for growth with drastic reductions of export earnings. Getting into debt, as it were, is not necessarily a bad business proposal, but not using the money borrowed productively in order to pay back when profit is made is a cardinal sin. It leads a business to continue borrowing simply to stay afloat, waiting for the day when to sell or be auctioned in order to get off the rat race. The sign that Kenya, as a business, has not been doing very well is reflected by the recent decision to join the G20 Debt Suspension Initiative, DSSI, in order to defer some of its external debt payments, potentially up to $630 million, while committing to utilize the freed resources for crisis-related spending. Some of Kenya's debt repayments, the Paris Club and China, to the tune of $545 million falling due within the first half of 2021, have been delayed. Perhaps unsurprisingly, from April 2020, Kenya borrowed over 551 billion Kenyan shillings from external sources, primarily multilateral creditors, to respond to the COVID-19 crisis. From the point of view of multilateral donors and the experts, Kenya's debt problem has graduated to being a structural problem where solutions proffered have to be structural adjustments. And Kenya entered into a 38-month IMF extended credit facility and the extended fund facility program from April 2021, which recommended a fiscal consolidation accompanied by structural reforms, protect the fiscal space and create a conducive environment for private sector credit and investment to boost economic growth, particularly in the medium term. It is assumed that implementation of this policy would give Kenya's national treasury the opportunity to change the structure of Kenya's public debt, most likely drastically reducing the high appetite of government to borrow from local banks through floating treasury bonds and bills at interest rates very attractive to the local banks. With scarcity of money to lend locally, the banks then make the cost of borrowing locally too high for the private sector, thereby stifling the local financing of local investments. The most recent public debt sustainability analysis shows that Kenya's level of debt distress has worsened from moderate to high. According to the IMF, Kenya's debt is sustainable, and its debt dynamics will be bolstered by the fiscal consolidation envisaged under the IMF-supported program. However, the risk of debt distress continues to be assessed as high, notwithstanding the IMF EFF/ECF program that seeks to relieve Kenya of this debt distress. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments. In your testimony, Governor Nyong'o, you spoke about the need to drastically change the structure of Kenya's public debt. And this is surely true of many other countries across the globe. But how much power do the governments of these countries have to exercise at the IMF? For instance, we heard about Greece, a country that was forced to accept economic policies that led to disastrous consequences. But this, at least some argue, resulted in some introspection of pro-cyclical policies in Europe. But what's stunning is if you look at countries in the global south where a majority of the IMF's programs operate and where there's scope for most harm, the policies over the decades have been virtually unchanged. So this double standard, I suppose, could be attributed to the oversized influence that a country like the US plays in the IMF, which, Fernanda, you talked about as well. So I want to turn to a member of the inquiry from the US, Congressman Jesus Chuy Garcia, who is a representative for the 4th Congressional District of Illinois. Congressman, policymakers and economists from the US have been some of the principal actors or culprits in pushing an austerity agenda onto the world. In your opinion, has the pandemic and the crisis that followed given us an opportunity to pause and call some of those claims into question? Would love to hear from you.
I'm honored to join people from all over the world today to ask big questions about the International Monetary Fund. The IMF was created to promote sustainable economic growth around the world. Does it serve the people of the world, or does it serve a few people in Washington? My name is Jesus Chuy Garcia, and I represent the 4th District of Illinois in the U.S. Congress. Like many of my neighbors, I was born in Mexico. Now I represent them in Washington and sit on the House Financial Services Committee, which oversees the United States work with the IMF. Many families in my community came here looking for opportunity or looking for refuge. Many left their homes because the IMF's failed policies of austerity made a few people very rich and left millions without hope for a better future. It's my responsibility to bring their stories to Washington, and it's our responsibility to hold our government and the IMF accountable to the people. From the village in my hometown of Los Pinos, Durango, where I was born in Mexico, to the little village neighborhood of Chicago, where I've lived for over 50 years. Working people across the world deserve a new vision for global development. For too many years, the legacy of the IMF has been austerity. We all know what austerity means. It means closed hospitals. It means overcrowded classrooms. It means layoffs and pay cuts. It means our neighbors go from crisis to crisis. Our communities know austerity has failed. The IMF's own economists know it. But the rich and powerful keep pushing this failed agenda. They did it in Argentina. They did it in Mexico. And it's up to us to stop it. Our communities can't afford these failed policies anymore. We need a new model to end the COVID-19 pandemic, to confront the climate crisis, to end poverty and hopelessness. So from here in Chicago, home of the Chicago boys, but also home to millions more who suffer from austerity, I joined the call for accountability for the IMF. And I ask, the IMF's mission is to reduce poverty around the world. Is it achieving that goal? Can the IMF help us fight global challenges like pandemics and the climate crisis? Or will it tie us to policies that have failed our communities? I'm excited to join with all of you as we demand answers from the IMF and our government. Thank you.
Thank you, Congressman. It's crucial that legislators from the US hold the IMF to account because it's really the US, along with countries in Western Europe, that control the decisions at the IMF. I mean, by design, the IMF distributes its power unequally. The US enjoys something close to 16% of the voting share. 20 of the OECD countries, the majority of whom are rich countries, high-income countries, enjoy more than 60% of the voting share combined. And it's the US and the European Union that exercise veto power over any of the IMF's decisions. And what this means is that it's a very skewed relationship between those implementing the policies inside the IMF and those experiencing the effects of these programs. Our next member of the inquiry is Jayati Ghosh from India, who's currently a professor of economics at the Political Economy Research Institute in University of Massachusetts, Amherst. Jayati, you wrote a piece recently called The Real Rot at the IMF, referring to this problem. Having now heard the testimonies from Greece, Argentina, and Kenya, I want to go back to the provocative question posed right at the beginning. Should the IMF exist? And if yes, how do we deal with this rot and make it fit for purpose?
The IMF was set up when the world was recovering from a terrible war and when there was a period of great global instability. And it was designed to combat that instability by displaying international cooperation. It still can do this. It can still provide a framework for global cooperation at a time when it's more necessary than ever. But let us admit that it has not really fulfilled those goals, and it has fulfilled them even less over the recent decades. There are many acts of commission, which I'm sure are well known now to many people, and which will be discussed extensively by others. There are the injustices perpetrated by the kinds of conditionalities that are imposed by the IMF on countries that are already in distress. These standards of fiscal discipline, which seem to be very double standards because they are applied differently to rich countries and poor countries. The requirements of cutting down public expenditure on some of the most essential public services, which has led to a hollowing out of many public services that we experienced the terrible impacts of, certainly in the last pandemic, but also in earlier pandemics like Ebola and H1N1 and others. The impacts of these programs on the social and economic rights of people, the privileging of the interests of large capital over human rights and the planet, the general assumption that what is good for profits and for encouraging investor confidence, it will therefore be good for the economy as a whole and for the requirements of that society. All of these are very significant acts of commission. But I am actually now today more concerned about the acts of omission of the IMF. Why? Because this is a period when we need global thinking, global cooperation, multilateralism more than ever, because the challenges we face are global, whether the pandemic or future pandemics or the ongoing climate change. We now know from the IPCC report that we are really at a tipping point, that if we do not act urgently and immediately, we are going to face disasters and catastrophes that we cannot even begin to contemplate. And this will be felt most of all by the vulnerable and the poor and those who are already marginalized or not excluded because they're integrated into the system, but excluded from the benefits of past growth. So we need an IMF to act. We need it to act urgently, decisively, to do the things that are required to enable global public investment in the necessary investments for the challenges of our time, for both mitigation and adaptation, and for dealing with climate distress that is already occurring in many parts of the world. We need the IMF to enable countries to have the fiscal space, whether through much more significant expansion of the SDRs or the enabling of the unused SDRs in the system to be provided to countries without onerous conditionalities, without requirements of fiscal discipline that prevent them from making the required investments. We need both much more direction from the IMF and more flexibility from the IMF. In other words, we need the IMF to fulfill the mandate that was given to it in the Bretton Woods of providing a global system that will actually enable the global community to meet its challenges. At the moment, it is not meeting those. It lacks ambition, it lacks justice, it lacks the sense of equality that must pervade its actions. And so it's very, very important for the IMF to be held to account and to be responsive to these demands, not just its acts of commission, but also the acts of omission.
Thank you, Jayati. You've brought up a slightly new question onto the floor. It's not just about holding the IMF to account after it does something wrong, but holding it responsible for what it does not do, despite its mandate to ensure global financial stability. I mean, this brings to mind for me the IMF's failure to step in during the Asian financial crisis, say of 97, or Argentina in 1998, but also Ukraine today in 2022, which needs financial support more than ever in this moment. So on that note, I want to turn to Yuri Romashko, who is the executive director of the Institute of Analysis and Advocacy in Ukraine. Yuri's team works in the Eastern Europe and Central Asian region and focuses on public finance and public policy research, including engagement with international financial institutions. Yuri, you have the floor.
Good afternoon, dear colleagues. First of all, let me thank Progressive International for the opportunity to take part in this event. Today is a difficult time for Ukraine. Beginning on February 24, a new reality began for us, for Ukrainians. The reality is cruel and painful. The Russian Federation has started a war against Ukraine, violating our territorial integrity and sovereignty. The consequences of the war are irreparable. Thousands of dead, millions of refugees, destroyed infrastructure, economic losses. This list goes on and on. Given the focus of our discussion of this event, I would like to focus actually on Ukraine's economic resilience. So I would like to emphasize that the war is forced to change the 13 initial parameters. The message I would like to deliver consists of two next theses. First, Ukraine needs significant and urgent financial support. And Ukraine wants to be responsible for its external debt. I will try to explain these two simple theses. First, Ukraine needs financial support more than ever given the circumstances in which the country finds itself. I will give just a few figures for your attention as an example. Custom. Ukraine will receive only 15 or 20% what was planned before the war. The explanation, as you understand, is simple. We don't have all the eastern and northern customs, blocked ports, and no customs clearance of goods. Currently, only the western border is open. Next thing is economic activity. According to average estimates, about 30% of businesses are currently not fully operate or had ceased all activities. In cities where active hostilities, as you understand, the situation is much worse. Infrastructure. The damage caused by the Russian army to Ukraine's infrastructure is estimated between 80 to $270 billion, depending on the valuation approaches. And as you understand, it's too early and impossible to talk about exact figures. According to joint estimates of the Ministry of Economy of Ukraine and the Kyiv School of Economics, the total loss of Ukraine's economy, property, loss of GDP, export, human capacity, etc., due to the war is already about between $500 and $600 billion. And we should understand that these are only primarily estimates. So therefore, economic resilience is one of the most important issues today, and we should understand that is expensive during the war. The Ukrainian government, the Ministry of Finance, the central bank are working hard to ensure balance of payments, budgetary needs, stabilize the economy. Financial support from the IFIs, from the European Union, from the other partners plays an important role today. Since the beginning of the war, Ukraine has received more than $3 and $2 billion from the various IFIs. For example, in particular, Ukraine received $1.4 billion disbursement under the IMF rapid financing instrument. But as you may understand, we need more. And the key question today is the ways, the financial instruments, conditions, how to do it best. And from the smallest, for example, even the question of surcharges, the total surcharges in 2022 that Ukraine has to pay to the IMF are estimated because of the various approaches between 114 millions and 178 millions. As I mentioned, it's dependent on the approach of this estimation. And if we can find a way, for example, temporary surcharges exemption, or ending this policy of charging countries significant surcharges or on larger loans that are not repaid quickly, we need to consider it, because every dollar is important to us today. Second thing, Ukrainians want to be responsible for foreign debt. Therefore, the Ukrainian government, as I mentioned previously, Ministry of Finance, today is not talking about the restructuring. They mentioned two reasons of this. First, the schedule of payment on the external debt until September doesn't include payments on its repayment, which Ukraine would not be able to cope with. And there is a need to further attract resources, concessional and commercial financial, and therefore Ukraine must be a reliable partner and timely service debt. And it's just a few very simple outline parameters. Based on them, I would like to identify some of the ways, maybe the best ways, what to do and how to support Ukraine. First thing, we need more grants instead of loans to avoid the accumulation of a debt burden. For example, Ukraine received a 120 million grant from the European Commission as a part of General Emergency Financial Assistance Package to Ukraine. Second thing, despite we are already receiving, but we need more unconditional budget support substantially from the current levels. Third thing, I guess you've heard, the IMF approved an administered account for Ukraine. The administered account is intended to channel donors' resources in the form of grants and loans aimed at assisting Ukraine to meet our balance of payments and budgetary needs, and in general stabilize economy. We encourage everyone to support Ukraine through this mechanism. Maybe you've heard, for example, the government of Canada has proposed up to $1 billion Canadian dollars to be disbursed to Ukraine through this account. Fourth thing, as I mentioned, every dollar is important to us. And any additional payments to the loan, for example, IMF surcharges, as we've discussed, if we can find mechanisms such as temporary surcharges exemption or more end in this policy, we should discuss this in depth, of course, because it's a sensitive issues in my point of view, but we should discuss. And fifth thing, discussions on existing debt cancellation should be deeply and sensitively discussed and resolved in a way that it doesn't cause cross default on Ukraine's other debt or damage Ukraine's reputation as a reliable borrower. It's very significant in this situation. This is very short few thoughts. And concluding my brief speech, I would like finish with one thing. Ukraine will definitely win. Thank you.
Thank you, Yuri. The question of abolition of surcharges and cancellation of existing debt have been demands put forth by activists, especially in the global south, for many, many years. We know that cancelling international debt payments is the fastest way, is the easiest way to keep money that's crucial for public spending, keep that money inside the countries that need it the most, and free up those resources to tackle urgent crises, whether that's something like the COVID-19 pandemic or the climate crisis. And in Ukraine's case, medical expenditure during the war, as well as reconstruction efforts afterwards. Yet we see the IMF continue with its usual approach. So I want to turn now to Francisco Verbeek, who's a lawyer that specializes in collective actions, public interest litigation, and access to justice and judicial reform. Francisco, how can members of this inquiry move the IMF to truly fulfill its mandate? How can governments and people, members of our audience watching this inquiry today, hold the IMF accountable?
Hello. Thank you very much for inviting us to participate in this inquiry. My name is Francisco Verbeek from Argentina. I am speaking on behalf of the Coordinadora de Abogados de Interés Público, CAIP for its Spanish acronym, a group of activist lawyers that has been conducting a strategic litigation against the Argentinian executive power to bring light into the arbitrary and illegal origins of the standby credit the IMF granted to the country in 2018. My presentation will address four main questions. First, what did we find? Second, how we did it. Third, what are the implications of our finding from a domestic law perspective? And fourth, how can the global discussions on IMF accountability could benefit from strategic litigation at national levels like the one we have been conducting in Argentina? Let's start from the beginning. What did we find? To put it bluntly, we got access to governmental files and documents which demonstrate that the public officers who signed the letters of intent in 2018 acted in an open and manifest violation of two core Argentinian laws, the National Act of Administrative Proceedings and the Financial Administration Act. Those statutes require the executive power to comply with a series of objective requirements, control interventions, and procedural safeguards to assure that political discretion is exercised under the rule of law. Among them, it's essential to open an official file, to get legal and technical opinions before the decision, and to get a presidential decree to authorize the signature as well. It's important to bear in mind that all these requirements are essential for the validity of any executive decision on sovereign debt. That's why both acts clearly state that any violation of these requirements makes the decision null and void. However, none of these requisites were fulfilled to carry out the 2018 maneuver between the IMF and Mauricio Macri's administration. And when I say none of them, is literally none of them. For example, the official file was initiated by the Ministry of Finance on June 21st, 2018, while the first letter of intent was signed on June 12, 2018. That means the file was created 9 days after signing the letter, and 7 days after we filed the first case on access to public information. The legal opinion, in turn, was delivered after the first letter of intent was signed and explicitly acknowledged that the intervention should have been previous to that. Moreover, it tried to correct the violation, invoking ridiculous administrative precedents regarding minor formal requisite for appointing attorneys for trial. As to the previous technical opinion, it should have come from the central bank, and it should have analyzed how the loan was going to impact in the national balance of payments. Answering a petition for access to information, the central bank authorities expressly acknowledged that they didn't comply with this requirement and that, instead, they made a sort of concerted analysis with the IMF, the external creditor whose businesses and interests were at stake, and the Ministry of Finance, the governmental area whose political actions this technical opinion was precisely enacted to control. They also told us, in writing, that they reached an understanding, and because of that, they directly signed the letter of intent. The understanding, not surprisingly, was amended 3 months later and several times since then. Finally, there was no presidential decree authorizing the central bank's president and the Ministry of Finance to sign the letters of intent. The Financial Administration Act provides for the executive power to sign this sort of documents. In 2018, however, the president didn't sign the letters nor issue any decree to allow those public officers to do so. All the documents and files are available in a database hosted in fmiargentina.com. We invite you to navigate the website to verify by yourselves the accuracy of my statements. Second question, how did we get these files and documents? We did it through strategic litigation focusing mainly on access to information. At the beginning of this history, soon after the mass media informed the country about the agreement, the main attack against the decision, mostly political, but also through civil and criminal actions, was sustained on the fact that the letter of intent has not been discussed and approved by Congress. This was a deeply political debate because it called for a judicial review of the Financial Administration Act, which allows the president to sign this sort of agreement with multilateral organizations. And that's why we choose another path of inquiry, a very simple one, even a boring one. Did the executive power comply with the national regulations that demand the proceedings and requirements I have just told you about? We articulate most of our work with the National Movement of Recovery Companies, MENER, and with the Center of Public Policies Towards Socialism, CEPAS. Along the way, we also get support from the Center of Social and Legal Studies, CELS, Amnesty International Argentina, and the feminist movement, Ni Una Menos. Along these almost 4 years of work, we filed 3 administrative petitions for access to public information, 2 judicial claims for the same subject matter, several administrative petitions demanding for official investigation on the topic, and finally, a judicial claim asking for a declaration of nullity of the agreement. Nowadays, we have 2 of these cases pending before the Federal Supreme Court. One of them on access to information, where an appellate court held the executive power responsible for informing about several documents that remained undisclosed. The other one is the nullity case, where the court will have to address the issue of collective standing to sue after the case was dismissed without prejudice by a judge and an appellate court. Let's go for the third question. What are the implications of our finding from a domestic law perspective? Our conclusion regarding those implications is quite simple and equally concerning. The agreement is null and void. This is not our opinion, but the explicitly enacted consequence of violating the provisions of the 2 national laws I already mentioned. In other words, considering the official documents we discovered, from a regulatory and constitutional perspective, it's not possible to defend a different conclusion. This is not enough, of course. We have been struggling with the fact that even when the law is so clear and the evidence is so irrefutable, the judiciary doesn't seem willingly to even allow the discussion in the nullity case we filed. It seems that in the current scenario, the economic, social, and political stakes are so high that the law itself is unable to be enforced. And that is happening even in face of demonstrated manifest violations of rules that provide for, I insist, procedural safeguards to avoid an arbitrary exercise of state authority. We strongly hope the Supreme Court will assume its role as guardian of the Constitution and the rule of law. Given the situation I described and the fact that the country has already engaged in a new agreement with the IMF to pay the 2018 maneuver, this judicial intervention is the least Argentinian society deserves. Finally, the fourth question: how can the global discussions on IMF accountability could benefit from what we have been doing in Argentina? Before answering this question, you need to know that what happened in Argentina also happens in other countries. It seems to be a modus operandi of the IMF in partnership with neoliberal governments. Quick, secret, and informal proceedings without any sort of due diligence to impose unsustainable sovereign debt on developing countries. Besides Argentina, maybe the clearest case of this modus operandi is Ecuador. We have been working closely with Andrés Arauz's Andrés Chiriboga, and the similarities between countries regarding the recent agreements with the IMF are astonishing. We also have clues to infer that something similar happened, for example, in Bolivia and Costa Rica. Taking all these facts into account, and given the complexities of the international financial legal architecture, purposefully designed to provide for immunity to the IMF, to answer our last question, and as a sort of conclusion of this presentation, we have a proposal. Use our experience. Take it as a working method. By claiming access to public information and respect of the rule of law, this kind of strategic litigation has at least three relevant advantages. First, it provides for a territorial anchor, real faces, and concrete forums to demand accountability from national public officers for abusive and illegal agreements like the Argentinian one. Second, it simplifies and complements the political discussion by framing the issue in a very objective and almost non-debatable field, compliance with objective requirements required by domestic legislation. And third, it could bring about elements to support the country's negotiating position for eventual scenarios of sovereign debt restructuration, particularly because it can provide for strong evidence on the IMF lack of due diligence. In other words, the litigation experience we propose to transfer and invite you to implement could help to put at hand the seemingly unreachable international financial world, and by doing that, also contribute with solid basis for the political debate. We know that, at the end of the day, the main discussion here is not legal, but political, more precisely, geopolitical. But the IMF never acted alone. It always did it in partnership with national public officers. What we propose is to start doing the laundry at home. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Francisco. You brought up an important question about how the IMF works domestically. It finds bedfellows in national governments and local think tanks, which complicates the question on the table. So it's not just about changing the governance structure and policies of the IMF, but also about protecting national sovereignty or reducing the influence of the IMF over national economic policies of governments across the world. On that question, I want to invite Andrés Chiriboga from Ecuador to the floor. Andrés, you've engaged with the IMF as a member of the Council for Economic and Financial Policy and Regulation of Ecuador, representing the Ministry of Planning. In your experience, how does the IMF system undermine national constitutions and exert undue control?
Hello, and thank you for having me here today to tell you about Ecuador's recent history with the IMF, which, despite the latest changes of discourse, has been marked by the return of conditionalities that are in conflict with Ecuador's constitutional framework and jeopardize the exercise of economic and social rights in the country. By the time the IMF and Ecuador recently reformalized their relations in March 2019, this is 16 years after the last funds program in the country, the situation of the economy had rapidly deteriorated, not so much because of the impact of external shocks that were relevant indeed, but because of the series of economic policies since the end of 2017 that were implemented by the government of former President Lenín Moreno. Those deteriorated, diminished its fiscal capacities, and undermined its liquidity management tools. These decisions were not only aligned with the demands of the country's economic elites, but also formally coordinated with the IMF. Following a visit of his finance minister to Washington, D.C. in September 2017, President Moreno sent his first set of economic reforms to the National Assembly, which were substantially criticized and modified in the legislative debate. Nevertheless, Moreno's administration triggered important fiscal cuts and insisted on the reforms. It was in August 2018 that the Ecuadorian government succeeded finally in passing a so-called productive promotion bill that prohibited the government from presenting a budget with deficit, included strong tax exceptions for the wealthiest, and weakened the existing mechanisms against tax evasion. This, of course, was a way of justifying further budget cuts. On the other hand, the bill mortally wounded the government's liquidity management tools, for example, by restricting investment of central banks' liquidity surpluses in securities issued by the Ministry of Finance. These reforms and policies accelerated the country's economic and social crisis, which was used to justify formally knocking on the IMF's door again and signing the 4.2 billion credit facility that included a classic program of structural adjustment. It is also important to point out that the transparency in the negotiation of this agreement was objected by several organizations such as Acción Jurídica Popular and Centro de Derechos Económicos y Sociales that filed access to information actions. The lack of transparency and due process are constant in negotiations between governments and the IMF. In Ecuador and other countries such as Argentina, these have been denounced and documented by civil society organizations. Why this keeps happening is something that not only local authorities, but the IMF itself should be accountable for. In line with the program, at the beginning of October 2019, President Moreno announced reforms in the areas of social security, privatization, labor flexibilization, and the immediate elimination of key fuel subsidies without any evaluation of the impact this would have on prices and people's purchasing power, and also without any alternative to this decision. The announcement sparked popular indignation that turned into massive mobilizations that lasted for days. The negative impacts of IMF reforms on economic and social rights, as well as the violent response of Moreno's government, we're speaking of 11 deaths and more than 1,300 people injured, were severely condemned by multiple international organizations, including the United Nations Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights and the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights. The protests temporarily stopped the reform of fuel subsidies that were later imposed in the middle of the pandemic, and also the protests pushed for the rejection by an unprecedented parliamentary majority of a bill that intended to implement changes to 22 laws in accordance with commitments that Ecuador had made with the IMF. These two events marked the failure of this first program, or this first part of the program with the IMF. However, after a transitional phase where Ecuador signed another financing facility for $640 million, it was in September 2020 that Ecuador and the IMF signed the largest credit agreement in the country's history. I'm speaking of the current $6.5 billion facility, which to a large extent resumed previous conditionality. As expected, the current IMF program insists that the resources disbursed by it cannot be used by any means to realize the fiscal consolidation objectives that the program has. For the IMF, in other words, the loan must only be used for international payment needs, or, if you wish, to repay the IMF itself and to repay other creditors. This program also revealed another major problem that was not addressed: the inaction of the fund regarding the capital flight program, which was more severe during the pandemic, as signaled by the IMF itself. In November 2020, shortly after the signing of this agreement, several local organizations, together with the Progressive International, met the IMF and presented our concerns on economic and social rights and the lack of attention to the serious problem of capital flight, considering the fact that the IMF Articles of Agreement required to address this issue during the duration of its programs. At the same time, we acknowledge something very important, which is that the fund's specialists were quite aware of the issue and understood the particularities of Ecuador's case. However, the IMF program keeps insisting, until today, on phasing out current mechanisms without considering any capital flow management measures, CFMs, like suggested by the fund's independent evaluation office, whose reports have been broadly supported by the IMF board of directors. Despite the IMF awareness of these problems, and since the program and its indicators have not changed, several organizations, like the ones I mentioned before, Acción Jurídica Popular, Centro de Derechos Económicos y Sociales, Observatorio de la Dolarización, and several citizens, filed constitutional protection actions against the program for its rights violations, especially speaking about labor rights, and for its insistence on the unconstitutional separation of the central bank from the executive branch of government. One of these actions was actually accepted by a constitutional judge of first instance who ruled that the government of Ecuador must adjust its economic program to the constitution and to the development plan. The government has challenged that decision in a second instance, while at the same time, and among other things, the unconstitutional reforms to the central bank are already in place and the liberal reform might be on its way. The current government of Ecuador, of former banker and multimillionaire Guillermo Lasso, is now in charge of the continuity of this credit facility that matches his economic policy agenda. In the last program's evaluations of last year, the IMF set even more aggressive fiscal consolidation goals despite the results of the management of public debt, higher oil prices, and improvements in tax collection. These more aggressive targets currently imposed by the IMF on Ecuador speak of a reduction of current spending of 4.5% of GDP, which we're speaking about $5 million, to be met by 2025. The last evaluation that was done insists on deepening the liberalization of interest rates, which is something that started already with the previous government, so they reflect market conditions. From reading the report itself, we can see that the system intends to allow higher rates that would actually make access to credit more difficult and would also prevent debt refinancing programs for firms and individuals in the country, which is an issue that has not been seriously addressed since the beginning of the pandemic. COVID seemed to push for a change of discourse for entities like the IMF. Kristalina Georgieva, just weeks ago in the World Economic Forum, insisted once more that the world must spend the billions necessary to contain COVID in order to gain trillions. However, the recent history between Ecuador and the IMF, the outdated recipes seem to be more alive than ever, distancing the country from guaranteeing economic and social rights, and even incurring in flagrant unconstitutionalities in which the IMF continues to be an accomplice. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Andres. What's striking for me in both your speech and Francisco's is the sheer scale of citizen mobilization against the IMF. We know that thousands of people have been marching in the streets of Argentina. Andres, you mentioned a number of organizations filing constitutional claims, constitutional protection actions against the IMF for rights violations. So people have been out there saying what many of you are saying here today. It seems there's just nobody to hear them. One such movement is also the feminist one that places foreign debt at the center of what it calls economic violence. On that question, I want to invite to the floor Lucia Caballero, who is our next member of the inquiry and an expert on the link between debt, illegal capital, and different forms of violence. Lucia is also a member of the Ni Una Menos collective and a researcher at the University of Buenos Aires. The floor is yours, Lucia.
Hola a todas, a todos, a todes. Agradezco a la Internacional Progresista por esta invitación y por esta solidaridad frente a un poder global tan inmenso que solo puede vencerse haciendo alianzas internacionales, heterogéneas e inclusivas. Mi nombre es Lucía Caballero, soy militante feminista del movimiento Ni Una Menos, un movimiento que surgió en el año 2015 para denunciar la violencia por razones de género, donde el femicidio es su máxima expresión. Este movimiento fue creciendo a lo largo del tiempo y fue también investigando y vinculando las formas en que se imbrican, se relacionan las violencias de género con las violencias económicas. En ese proceso, uno de los avances de estos años del movimiento feminista ha sido poner a la deuda externa en el centro de lo que llamamos violencias económicas. Nos hemos visto desafiadas a inventar nuevos vocabularios de lucha para denunciar el impacto de la deuda externa en la vida cotidiana y las formas concretas de empobrecimiento y precarización que genera. Junto a la invención de estos vocabularios, hemos además producido alianzas con sindicatos, agrupaciones estudiantiles y distintos movimientos para enfrentar a la deuda en sus distintas manifestaciones. Así, desde 2018 hemos avanzado en visibilizar y poner en agenda pública el impacto que el préstamo stand-by de Argentina con el Fondo Monetario Internacional, llevado a cabo por el gobierno neoliberal de Mauricio Macri, tuvo y tiene en la vida y en los derechos de mujeres, lesbianas, travestis y trans, y cómo este préstamo y sus condicionamientos se tradujo en restricciones concretas a la hora de garantizar la reproducción social de grandes mayorías de la población en Argentina. Es importante destacar que este ciclo de endeudamiento es uno de los más importantes de nuestra historia. Al mismo tiempo es uno de los mayores préstamos otorgados en la historia del Fondo Monetario, y a su vez es importante destacar que este dinero que ha ingresado a la Argentina no ha significado ningún beneficio para las poblaciones más vulnerables, sino que, por el contrario, ha sido fugado al exterior en su totalidad. Quisiera hablar de las condicionalidades de este programa económico asociado a este préstamo stand-by, que han reforzado las desigualdades de género en aspectos como la inclusión previsional, la informalidad laboral, la precarización del trabajo feminizado, el aumento del trabajo no remunerado y el aumento del endeudamiento doméstico para hacer frente a estas condiciones de ajuste. Este préstamo entonces tuvo un impacto diferencial, que se puede medir muy concretamente en estadísticas que hablan justamente de esta mayor vulnerabilidad de la población feminizada. Como los feminismos lo han evidenciado, el sistema económico está sustentado en la dirección sexual del trabajo, que hace que sean las mujeres y cuerpos feminizados quienes carguen con la mayor parte del trabajo no remunerado y que sean quienes peores trabajos remunerados obtienen. El proceso de endeudamiento externo y las políticas de austeridad han extendido las jornadas de trabajo no pago como consecuencia de los recortes en servicios públicos. Un ejemplo muy elocuente es que el gobierno de Mauricio Macri, por exigencia del Fondo Monetario, ha dado de baja el Ministerio de Salud y obviamente recortó su presupuesto. La movilización colectiva, tramada especialmente al calor del proceso político de las huelgas feministas, que también fueron internacionales, visibilizó y valorizó los trabajos reproductivos, de cuidados y atención, al mismo tiempo que denunció la brecha salarial que se sustenta en la división sexual del trabajo. En materia previsional, el Fondo Monetario Internacional desde 2018 ha promovido reformas estructurales que el gobierno de Mauricio Macri aplicó en un contexto de represión a la protesta social. Estas reformas implicaron en primer lugar un desfinanciamiento de la seguridad social y una baja de la cobertura del sistema previsional, afectando principalmente a las mujeres. Una de estas reformas, y quizás la más importante y que aún no ha sido revertida, es la interrupción de un sistema de moratorias previsionales implementado durante el gobierno anterior al de Mauricio Macri, que permitía y que beneficiaba a mujeres marcadas por trayectorias laborales en donde hay un mayor nivel de informalidad y además por trabajo no remunerado. Estas moratorias permitían que esas mujeres se jubilen y se aumentara el nivel de protección social. Bueno, esa moratoria fue reemplazada por una pensión universal que implicó, de hecho, un aumento de la edad necesaria para acceder a un beneficio provisional, al mismo tiempo que redujo el gasto previsional, dado que esta pensión es un 20% más baja que un haber previsional. Esto produjo un refuerzo de las desigualdades entre quienes tienen trayectorias laborales marcadas por la informalidad y donde las mujeres son abrumadora mayoría. Nosotras desde los feminismos y a partir de la confluencia con el movimiento sindical, logramos evidenciar que este recorte de derechos a jubilaciones, especialmente destinadas a mujeres, y aquellas que realizaron durante toda su vida trabajo no remunerado o mal pago, como un recorte castigo. Hemos dicho que es un intento de disciplinamiento que viene aparejado a este ajuste económico. Al mismo tiempo, los condicionamientos que implicaron el acuerdo de stand-by han implicado una caída en el poder adquisitivo de jubilaciones, de salarios y de subsidios sociales, tan importantes para las mujeres como la asignación universal por hijo. Y aquí un punto muy importante en las formas en que el feminismo ha denunciado esta realidad, y es cómo el endeudamiento con el Fondo Monetario Internacional al mismo tiempo se tradujo en políticas de ajuste que se derramaron en los hogares como deuda doméstica. Así, producto de la inflación, la consecuente pérdida de poder adquisitivo de subsidios y salarios y de la dolarización de alimentos y medicamentos, se produjo una realidad en la cual se volvió necesario el endeudamiento privado, el endeudamiento de las familias, para acceder a los bienes más básicos. La particularidad de este fenómeno es que el endeudamiento es masivo y ya no aparece asociado a un consumo puntual de un bien o un servicio, sino que se transformó en una forma permanente de completar los ingresos. Esta realidad afectó en particular a las mujeres, quienes se endeudaron principalmente a través de subsidios sociales y quienes son las principales sostenedoras de las economías domésticas y particularmente en momentos de crisis económicas. Por ello el feminismo ha especialmente analizado y difundido qué es lo que pasa cuando tomar deuda se convierte en una obligación para sobrevivir, para comprar alimentos, para pagar gastos de salud, para pagar alquileres, haciendo y tendiendo una relación muy clara entre endeudamiento externo y mayores niveles de endeudamiento privado. Volviendo a esas condicionalidades que implicó el acuerdo stand-by firmado en 2018 por el gobierno de Mauricio Macri, en materia laboral, si bien el Fondo Monetario Internacional incluyó un lenguaje, digamos, de género en sus propuestas, que básicamente consistió en recomendar aumentar la participación laboral de las mujeres en el mercado laboral, durante todo este periodo las brechas laborales de género han crecido. Ha habido una mayor desocupación y una mayor tasa de informalidad de las mujeres. Al mismo tiempo, el presupuesto destinado para combatir la violencia de género desde 2018 se vio afectado y reducido significativamente. Actualmente, y durante la pandemia, esta situación se ha agravado, ¿no? Ha habido una caída aún mayor en los ingresos, tanto de salarios como de subsidios, ha habido un aumento en la desocupación y sobre todo ha habido un incremento de las tareas de cuidado, tanto en el hogar como en las comunidades asociadas a la crisis sanitaria. En este momento, más del 40% de la población se encuentra bajo la línea de la pobreza y es en este contexto que el Fondo Monetario Internacional sigue exigiendo un ajuste. Para finalizar, quisiera destacar que el movimiento Ni Una Menos viene movilizándose desde el año 2017, denunciando esta deuda como una guerra contra las autonomías de las mujeres lesbianas, travestis y trans. Hemos desarrollado la consigna que pusimos en las calles, que dice que vivas, libres y desendeudadas nos queremos, instalando la relación entre deudas, precariedad y mayor exposición a las violencias de género. También hemos utilizado durante las últimas movilizaciones la consigna que la deuda es con nosotras y con nosotres y no con el Fondo Monetario Internacional, para evidenciar qué es lo que se nos debe y proponernos como acreedoras de una riqueza que ya produjimos. El desafío que tenemos hacia adelante es avanzar en ese proceso de ilegitimación de la deuda, que por supuesto tiene un punto importante en la herramienta jurídica, pero que necesita además combinarse con otras prácticas políticas concretas de confrontación con las condiciones que impone el Fondo Monetario y donde el internacionalismo tiene un rol fundamental. Finalmente, los feminismos hemos planteado que la deuda con el Fondo Monetario Internacional tomada en el año 2018 con sus condicionalidades y planes de ajuste es una guerra contra la posibilidad de vivir una vida libre de violencias, contra la posibilidad de aumentar los presupuestos para políticas de género y contra la posibilidad de avanzar en políticas que reparen las desigualdades que arrastramos. Más que nunca seguiremos discutiendo esta deuda en todas sus dimensiones, lo que implica cuestionar su legitimidad, sus cómplices locales que se enriquecieron y fugaron ese dinero al exterior y sus formas de chantaje en el día a día. Hasta que no quede ni un funcionario del Fondo Monetario Internacional en Argentina, y para eso necesitamos de estas alianzas internacionales que son fundamentales.
Thank you for that testimony, Lucia. Well over decades ago, feminists had popularized the slogan, "Who owes whom?" calling into question the entire cycle of debt and patterns of colonial appropriation that continue to this day. So we're really honored to hear from you about the feminist movement's engagement with debt justice that continues to this day. Let's turn now to another country that's also seen huge protests against the IMF, Kenya. I want to invite the next member of the inquiry, Martin Ogundo, onto the floor from Kenya. He's a politician and party leader of the Green Congress of Kenya, a representative of the Rangwe constituency in the National Assembly of Kenya, and chairman of the Fiscal Analysis and Appropriations Committee of the Kenyan Parliament. Martin, you have the floor.
Thank you, Progressive International, for having me. My name is Martin Ogundo. I live in Nairobi, Kenya. I am honored to have this invitation to share my experience in the relationship between Kenya and IMF. Kenya got its independence in 1963 and became a republic in 1964. And Kenya immediately joined IMF. From that period, the relationship was very good, and I think Kenya benefited immensely from the support by IMF. We saw tremendous growth in our social sectors, and we saw tremendous growth in our infrastructure system. We saw tremendous growth in our governance system, and I think those were very good benefits that came out of the relationship between Kenya and IMF. Things started going south in the late 80s and early 90s when IMF introduced the structural adjustment programs. The structural adjustment programs had the impact of disrupting our social structure and also of impoverishing Kenyans' citizens. I remember one of the conditionalities for continued borrowing from IMF in the early 90s was that we had to do retrenchment in Kenya. The public service had to be reduced. That meant sacking Kenyans from their jobs. And that resulted into a lot of families suffering as their dependents were left jobless. Other critical sectors suffered as well. And I want to mention about education, health sector, housing, energy, transport, and even water. Education is very critical to the growth of any country. And our education system was flourishing up to 1990. When the structural adjustment came, we had to divest from our education system. And ever since, we have suffered lack of infrastructure in our schools and all our learning institutions. We have equally suffered lack of remuneration for our teachers. We have suffered lack of investment in our research and development. And today, education at the lowest level has no infrastructure, right from kindergarten through to primary up to secondary schools. Our universities are dilapidated. Most of them are bankrupt. So in essence, the IMF conditionalities has ruined our education sector. Not to mention that the quality of graduates that we get today are quite low. And it did not stop there. The health sector has been ruined too. Up to 1990, you could get medicine literally in every health center. You will get personnel literally in every health center. Today, you go to level 4 hospitals, you go to level 5 hospitals. First of all, they are congested. Secondly, they have no medicine. Thirdly, they have very few personnel. And fourthly, the personnel are not adequately compensated. The housing sector was doing very well until 1990, when Kenya decided, as a condition by IMF, to liberalize the housing sector. Kenya, that used to put up housing for its citizens, affordable houses, stopped the venture. And today, housing has been left in the hands of private sector. This has made housing a very, very unaffordable commodity in Kenya, rendering most Kenyans homeless. As a condition, we were forced to liberalize our energy sector. This has seen the entrance of private sectors who are profiteering from our energy sector, making energy in Kenya unaffordable. We have the KenGen, which was a parastatal government institution to develop and generate electricity. But the liberalization introduced the private power operators, which have forced government to enter with them into power purchase agreements that are quite exorbitant, thereby making the price of power unaffordable in Kenya. The water sector was not spared either. Now, these conditionalities have seriously disrupted our social structure. And the result is an impoverished citizenry, a dysfunctional education sector, a dysfunctional health sector, a dysfunctional housing sector. Kenyans have been left to fend for themselves as the policies being pursued by the administration is hardly pro-people, but pro-IMF. IMF has been lending to Kenya, and all the loans that have been lent to Kenya have had the net effect of having a net outflow of funding. I know the Europeans are very lucky or are very creative. In 1992, the European Union signed the Maastricht Treaty that created the European Union, which has created an economic union for the European countries. And we have seen tremendous growth in Europe ever since. In Africa, 10 years after the Maastricht Treaty, African Union was created. I'm yet to feel the impact of African Union as a Kenyan and as an African. I expected African Union to protect not only the integrity of African countries, but the resources of Africa, because this is our most valuable asset on this planet. But with WTO, most of the trade agreements are tilted against Africa and its resources. Most of our resources are extracted and exported raw, extracted by multinationals, processed in the foreign countries to our detriment. AU must make an intervention that safeguards the resources of Africa. We must not allow this exploitation. I know the unholy trinity of IMF, World Bank, and WTO are created in such a way that the developing countries are left to sign on the dotted lines. Countries borrow, but the citizens don't know what the borrowings are for. In the spirit of transparency and accountability, I expect IMF, World Bank, to always put a paid advert to show the country that is borrowing, to show the citizens of a country borrowing from them that today we are lending your country so much money for such and such a project. Transparency is required. Otherwise, money is borrowed secretly, money is spent secretly, citizens are left with debts whose benefits they did not see. I want to conclude by saying that the IMF, World Bank, WTO, and all the institutions of global governance must work for the benefit of the entire world population. Africa is rich in resources. The global north is rich in technology. We must cultivate a win-win situation whereby the global north will bring their technology and the global south will bring their resources, and the end product is shared 50-50 for the benefit of the globe. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Martin. You spoke of transparency, which in many ways is a prerequisite for accountability. One of the things that took me by surprise when I got into this work is just how many of these agreements happen in almost total secrecy. Citizens of the country and sometimes elected representatives have barely any knowledge of how these deals are made until it's too late. A glaring example of this in recent times is Pakistan, which rushed through a State Bank of Pakistan Amendment Bill, as it's called, and members of the parliament themselves complained that the proposed amendment bill had very serious and far reaching implications for the monetary sovereignty of Pakistan, but that the government did not allow even a full day to the legislatures for consideration. So let's go to Pakistan next. I want to invite to the floor our member of inquiry from Pakistan, Akmal Hussain, who is a distinguished professor and dean at the School of Humanities and Social Sciences at ITU in Lahore. He's a co-chair of the governing board of the South Asia Center for Policy Studies and a senior fellow at the Pakistan Institute of Development Economics. Akmal, you have the floor.
Hello, colleagues and friends across the world. I've been asked to very quickly, in just 4 or 5 minutes, indicate what the impact of the IMF program this time around has been. The IMF program basically had 4 conditions. And these conditions together resulted in much higher inflation rates and higher unemployment and poverty. Let me explain why this happened, given the design of the program. The program consists of 4 elements. The first is to reduce the budget deficit, which translates into reduced development expenditure of the government. So public sector expenditure declines, which slows down growth. And the second is to raise the interest rate, which slows down private sector investment because credit becomes more expensive. So the first 2 elements slow down overall GDP growth. The next 2 elements, as I just explained, cause an increase in inflation rates. The next 2 elements are first the withdrawal of subsidies from critical services like electricity and gas, utilities, and fuel. And second, they devalue the currency. And when devaluation occurs, it increases the imported price of the rupee price of imported inputs as well as finished goods, and that also causes an across-the-board increase in inflation. So of the 4 conditions, the first 2 result in higher unemployment and poverty through slowing down growth, and the second 2 conditions cause an increase in the inflation rate. That's in fact what's happened. So the people of this country have suffered a double whammy. Much higher levels of unemployment and poverty on the one hand, together with high rates of inflation. So much so that food has gone out of the grasp of a large number of people. And you have cases of mothers committing suicide because they can't feed their children. And so we paid a very heavy price as a result of adopting the IMF program. And there are no prospects of any improvement on a sustainable basis, either in the balance of payments or in the growth situation. I would like to express my solidarity with other fellow sufferers across the world. There are so many countries that have adopted this program with similar results. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Akmal. For our last 2 contributions, let's zoom in on 2 key features of this broken system. One is the double standard for poor and rich countries, leading to a callous approach to democracy, violations of human rights, violations of internal regulations, and eventual extraction of wealth from countries in the global south. The second is the absence of any mechanism to oversee, control, or fix any of these problems in the way that the IMF operates. I want to hear from Karina Patricio from Brazil, who is the next member of our inquiry and who's a lecturer in commercial law at the University of Leeds and an expert in international financial monetary law and sovereign debt. Karina, could you illustrate for us just how the IMF escapes responsibility despite decades of, whether you call them mistakes, missteps, wrongdoing?
Hello, I'm Karina Patricio, and I'm delighted to join the Progressive International's inquiry on the IMF because I believe this is a crucial issue to ensure sustainable development for all at a global level. The international monetary system is actually structurally broken, and it creates a concentration of wealth and power at a global level depending on the level of monetary hierarchies of each nation. The IMF is a big part of this picture as it operates to impose the burden of adjustment on jurisdictions facing balance of payments problems through its conditionality policy, which is typically highly recessionary and produces wealth concentrating effects within and across countries. And for systemic reasons, the burden of adjustment is imposed on the most vulnerable countries on earth, typically global south countries who are facing those balance of payments problems, which are systemically created because that's how the international monetary system currently operates. And a key dimension of the IMF's dysfunctional role in the international monetary system relates to the overstepping of its own legal mandates when approving programs in the exercise of its lending functions. This has become particularly problematic as the IMF adopted the role of international lender of last resort since the end of the Bretton Woods system, providing increasingly significant exceptional access financing on the basis of weak macroeconomic assumptions and exceptionally politicized criteria. And the most significant example of this dysfunctionality in history has been the exceptional access standby arrangement with Argentina approved in 2018, which was the largest fund program in history and possibly its largest failure. I've written a paper on this matter together with my co-author Chris Marsh, where we integrate a macroeconomic study of this program with a critique from a legal standpoint. And we introduced the hypothesis that the standby arrangement concluded with Argentina in 2018 violated the core purposes of the IMF as per its articles of agreement, and therefore constitutes a neuter viris act, which means that it's a loan where the IMF has overstepped its own mandate. And the effect of a ultra viris act in this case is that it's voidable under international law. Basically, we argue that the fund has acted ultra viris in approving this standby arrangement for two main substantive reasons. First, it did not ensure adequate safeguards for the provision of its general resources. This is basically because the program was structurally designed without any kind of regard to external adjustment. There were manifestly unreasonable assumptions about private inflows and also a substantial accounting black hole of around $20 billion. And also, as a result, the IMF here has overestimated debt sustainability and approved exceptional access in violation of its own exceptional access policy. And the agreement has produced significant IMF exposure to Argentina's unsustainable debt, which the fund itself has exacerbated upon approval of this standby arrangement. And the second key argument that we make that justifies our point that the IMF has violated its legal mandate in approving this standby arrangement is that it was reasonably foreseeable at the time of design and approval of the program that it would result in an extension of the duration and magnification of the degree of disequilibrium of Argentina's balance of payments. This is because there were no capital management requirements in this program, which based on its own experience and data that the IMF reasonably ought to have taken into account, the fund was mandated to request from a legal standpoint. As a result, we argued that this program is voidable under international law, and Argentina should be able to challenge it by proposing a resolution at the United Nations General Assembly that requires an advisory opinion to the International Court of Justice on the legality of this agreement. I hope this inquiry will raise awareness towards the need for a structural reform in the IMF and the way it currently operates to ensure a fairer international monetary system for all. Thank you.
Thank you, Karina. We've talked a lot about the IMF's policies and its effects on countries. But we're constantly sold this idea of a 21st century defined by rules-based international order. And at the risk of sounding like a broken record here, is the IMF really bound by no international laws, even when it comes to, say, fundamental human rights? On this, I want to invite Juan Pablo Bohuslavsky, who is a former United Nations independent expert on debt and human rights. Juan Pablo, you've worked with the UN system for a long time now. If the heads of the IMF were here today listening to our inquiry, they very well might be, what would their response to the questions posed by this inquiry be?
Many thanks for inviting me to participate today. I would like to share with you two thoughts today regarding the problematic relation between the IMF and human rights. And I don't want to refer now to how the IMF policies and conditionalities have violated for decades human rights, in particular economic and social rights of the debtor states population with no accountability. Instead, I want to refer to the official and explicit argument made regularly by the IMF in the sense that it is not bound by international human rights law, not even the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And first of all, I must say that, to my knowledge, no other public authority, neither national nor international, there's arguing in public that it is above human rights. While it is true that statutes prevent the World Bank and far less explicitly the IMF from making political considerations, it is difficult to argue that violating human rights can be part of a country's domestic political affairs. In other words, international financial institutions cannot simply disregard the harmful results on human rights of the policies that they encourage on the basis that these impacts constitute domestic political affairs over which they have no authority. What are the relevant international obligations that must be considered when granting a multilateral loan? Well, it has been argued that international human rights conventions, such as the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, only bind states parties, while the operation of international financial institutions are guided only by their own articles of agreement. However, the IMF and the World Bank are specialized agencies of the United Nations, and consequently they are required to act in conformity with the UN Charter, which refers to human rights. More importantly, as international organizations, they are clearly subject to international law and therefore must not violate customary international law or the general principles of international law. States cannot simply deploy instruments to circumvent the clear obligations under international law by deploying an international organization or an international financial institution to act on their behalf. Delegation cannot be used as an excuse to fail to comply with human rights obligations in abnegation of the extraterritorial character of these obligations. And this is actually how the UN Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights has interpreted the binding human rights obligations of international financial institutions. And let me finish with a proposal, or rather a historical and legal restatement. The Economic and Social Council, the so-called ECOSOC, under the authority of the UN General Assembly, coordinates the economic and social work of the UN system. The IMF is part of the UN system. They have even signed an agreement to regulate this relation between the IMF and the UN. So why the COSOC stopped several decades ago coordinating and even instructing the IMF? In a nutshell, I want to draw your attention to the fact that the IMF is, legally speaking, under the authority of the UN. And developing countries are missing, in my view, a precious opportunity by not mobilizing the ECOSOC to ensure that the IMF is more sensitive to human rights and to the right to development of developing countries. Thank you for having me today.
Thank you for your contribution, Juan Pablo. I guess that makes it absolutely clear. Currently, the IMF answers to no one and considers itself accountable to no one. With this inquiry, we say to the IMF, we question your immunity. You must answer for your crimes. Our rights are not for sale and cannot be bought away by your loans. We demand transparency for all of your programs and an honest accounting of the violations of laws internal to the IMF and externally at the national and international levels. We question your mandate. You must be held responsible for pushing austerity programs and undermining the sovereignty of countries, as well as for shirking responsibility when the same countries experience crises. And third, we question your governance. You must be held to account for the disproportionate power that certain countries wield at the IMF and for the indiscriminate way in which they hold and wield that power. With that, I want to close the inquiry into the IMF with a huge thank you to the members of this inquiry and to the team of researchers, designers, translators, and videographers that made this inquiry possible. And a huge thank you to you, our viewers. If you'd like to hold the IMF accountable, please submit your question at the website below. Click the button Ask the IMF, and we'll send these questions to the IMF as it meets next week. Thank you for watching.